America was made and continues to be made by those seeking a greater life. The Chinese, the Italians, the English, the French, the Japanese, the Germans, the African Americans, the Dutch, the Native Americans, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Scandinavians, the Indians, the Irish, the Russians, the Polish, the Arabians, the Peruvians, the Greeks, and the many others that have come from the many lands of this world. All of these great peoples continue to shape a country that breathes the air of ethnicity, not as individual cultures, but as one great culture, creating a great nation. This is America. In the late 1940s, communism, heightened by the terror of the mushroom cloud, was the cutting issue on which people voted. To be soft on communism was political suicide, and ambitious young men, such as one member of the House of Representatives by the name of Richard M. Nixon, could see that communist bashing was the key to the future. The new Red Scare would become front-page headlines in 1949 as Whittaker Chambers, a reformed Communist Party member and later an editor at Time magazine, charged that progressive Alger Hiss, a Roosevelt New Dealer, was a communist spy. To those who knew Hiss, this was nonsense that took the paranoia too far. But to conservatives, Hiss was blemished because he had been with Roosevelt at Yalta and was Secretary General of the United Nations Organizing Conference in 1945 and 46. Both Yalta and the UN were increasingly viewed as parts of the communist scheme for weakening America and achieving world domination. The fabulous 50s were off to a not-so-fabulous start. And now we present America, the Living Dream, Part 6, the 50s to the 90s. Chambers claimed that Hiss had been a communist who had given Chambers classified documents to be passed on to Moscow. Pressed by Congressman Richard Nixon in a hearing before the House Un-American Activities Committee investigating the alleged communist subversion in government, Hiss denied the allegations. Everything in his demeanor seemed to nullify the charges made by Chambers. But there were also some damaging revelations that left nagging suspicions. The most sensational of these came to light when Chambers produced the copies of old microfilm that had allegedly been concealed inside a hollowed-out pumpkin in Chambers' garden. Overnight, these became the Pumpkin Papers. The case might have blown over, except that Hiss sued Chambers for libel, and the evidence against Hiss turned out to be strong. In the courtroom, Chambers proved that he knew intimate details of Hiss's life. While the statute of limitations protected Hiss from espionage charges, he was indicted for perjury for lying to a congressional committee. Tried and convicted in January 1950, Hiss was sentenced to 5 years in prison. There are people who still argue about this case with passion today, as it was one of the first in what would become known as anti-communist witch hunts, such as the Rosenberg's execution in the era of McCarthyism. While time has put Senator Joseph McCarthy's hearings in place, his communist accusations caused many of those involved to be blacklisted and be marred for life. During the 1954 Army McCarthy hearings, Joseph N. Welch, special counsel for the Army, said in response to an attack by McCarthy and a young associate in Welch's firm,
"While you are quite an actor, You play for a laugh. I don't think you have any conception of the danger of the Communist Party.
Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness.
If Hiss and the Rosenbergs, Mao's millions, and McCarthyism weren't enough to strike fear into the 1950s America, 90,000 North Koreans did the trick. In June 1950, after a large-scale artillery barrage, the sound of bugles signaled the massed charge of North Koreans who came down out of the mountains to roll over an American-sponsored government in South Korea. Armed and trained by the Soviets, this was the most efficient fighting force in Asia after the Soviet Red Army. While the Korean War spanned only from 1950 to 1953, its impact was great. President Truman, before leaving office without running for a second term, due in part to a decline in popularity because of the war, relieved General Douglas MacArthur of his command during the war. Despite this, MacArthur was still a hero. When he left his headquarters in Japan in April 1951, he was given an emotional farewell, unique for a soldier who had conquered the country only half a dozen years earlier. On his way to the airport, 250,000 Japanese lined the 12-mile route. In San Francisco, it took him 2 hours to get through 500,000 well-wishers. When he came to Congress to address a joint session, he received a standing ovation. Applause interrupted his 34-minute address 30 times. His speech ended with the famous lines, "The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And, like the soldier of the ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty." Then came a hushed goodbye. There was pandemonium and sobbing in the House chamber. President Truman heard it on TV and commented that it was 100% horse manure. A similarly moving speech was delivered in September 1952 by then vice presidential candidate Richard Nixon, who was on the verge of being dumped by presidential candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower over charges of using an $18,000 annual fund collected by California businessmen for his own personal purposes. To clear his name, Nixon went on national television along with his wife and dog.
You are about to hear a report from Senator Richard Nixon, nominee for the office of Vice President of the United States. The senator has interrupted his nationwide campaign tour to be with you tonight for this important message. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Richard Nixon.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency and as a man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned. Now, the usual political thing to do when charges are made against you is to either ignore them or to deny them without giving details. I believe we've had enough of that in the United States, particularly with the present administration in Washington, D.C. To me, the office of the Vice Presidency of the United States is a great office, and I feel that the people have got to have confidence in the integrity of the men who run for that office and who might obtain it. I have a theory, too, that the best and only answer to a smear or to an honest misunderstanding of the facts is to tell the truth. And that's why I'm here tonight. I want to tell you my side of the case. There are still some who may say and rightfully so. And let me say that I recognize that some will continue to smear, regardless of what the truth may be, but that there has been, understandably, some honest misunderstanding on this matter. And there's some that will say, well, maybe you were able, Senator, to fake this thing. How can we believe what you say? After all, is there a possibility that maybe you got some sums in cash? What I am going to do. And incidentally, this is unprecedented in the history of American politics. I am going, at this time, to give to this television and radio audience a complete financial history. Everything I've earned, everything I've spent, everything I owe. And I want you to know the facts. Well, that's about it. That's what we have, and that's what we owe. It isn't very much, but Pat and I have the satisfaction that every dime that we've got is honestly ours. I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her that she'd look good in anything. One other thing I probably should tell you, because if I don't, they'll probably be saying this about me too. We did get something, a gift, after the election. A man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from the Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checker. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. And now, finally, I know that you wonder whether or not I am going to stay on the Republican ticket or resign. Let me say this. I don't believe that I ought to quit, because I'm not a quitter. And incidentally, Pat's not a quitter. After all, her name was Patricia Ryan, and she was born on St. Patrick's Day, and you know the Irish never quit. But the decision, my friends, is not mine. I would do nothing that would harm the possibilities of Dwight Eisenhower to become president of the United States. And for that reason, I am submitting to the Republican National Committee tonight through this television broadcast the decision which it is theirs to make. Let them decide whether my position on the ticket will help or hurt. And I'm going to ask you to help them decide. Wire and write the Republican National Committee whether you think I should stay on or whether I should get off. And whatever their decision is, I will abide by it.
In living rooms across America, people wept. Eisenhower decided to keep Nixon on his ticket. Though much of America was in tears during the Checkers speech, Nixon himself remained dry-eyed. Afterward, he flew to West Virginia to meet with Eisenhower. At the airport, cameras caught an emotional scene that included Nixon weeping on the shoulder of Senator William Noland. Tears came easily to Nixon. His old high school drama club director saw the pictures and recalled that in school plays, Nixon, quote, knew how to take direction and could cry real tears at each performance, unquote. When an armistice ending the Korean War was signed on July 27, 1953, the war ended where it had begun, at the 38th parallel. The war cost America 54,246 lives and another 100,000 casualties at an expense in excess of $70 million. After 3 years, the situation in Korea was almost exactly what it had been when the North Koreans first attacked the South. All of the fighting and deaths had changed almost nothing. and it has remained that way to this day. At home, the war produced a massive call for militarization and a buildup of American conventional and nuclear forces, strengthening what President Eisenhower himself would later label the military-industrial complex. Then, a 43-year-old seamstress who worked in a downtown department store, Rosa Parks, was on her way home from work on a December day in 1955. Mrs. Parks boarded the city bus and moved to the back, legally and traditionally the black section. Finding no seats there, she took one toward the middle of the bus. When the driver picked up more white passengers, he called out for any blacks to vacate seats designated for whites, even if it meant standing. Mrs. Parks refused. Unwilling to leave that seat, Rosa Parks was arrested for violating Montgomery's transportation laws. Mrs. Parks was ordered to court on the following Monday. But over the weekend, the black community of Montgomery met to protest Mrs. Parks' arrest and the reason for it. They selected the 27-year-old pastor of Mrs. Parks' church as their leader. Calling for a peaceful form of resistance, the young minister urged his people to boycott the buses of Montgomery. His name was Martin Luther King, Jr.
Let me urge you to be sane and rational. Eventually, segregation in public transportation will pass away. Eventually. And I think we should start now preparing for the inevitable. And let us, when that moment comes, go into the situations that we confront with a great deal of dignity, sanity, and reasonableness.
In a short time, the bus boycott and the movement it inspired in Montgomery would raise him to world fame and make him one of America's most admired and reviled men.
The decision rendered by the Supreme Court yesterday was a victory. Yeah. But it wasn't a victory for colored folks. Don't make that victory that small. It wasn't a victory for 50,000 Negroes of Montgomery. It wasn't merely a victory for 16 million Negroes of America. That was a victory for justice and goodwill.
Now, what will be our mode of action in the light of this decision? After thinking through this question very seriously, the Executive Board of the Montgomery Improvement Association recommends that the 11-month-old protest against the city buses will be called off, and that the Negro citizens of Montgomery, Alabama will return to the buses on a non-segregated basis. Are you ready for the question? All in favor, let it be known by standing on your feet. It seems that it is carried unanimously.
Nine black school children in Little Rock, Arkansas, also helped bring the civil rights movement to the attention of the nation. When they were denied access to the Little Rock Central High School in September 1957, Eisenhower was forced to leave his hitherto ambiguous stance on the civil rights movement and send 1,100 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne to Little Rock.
An extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights. If resistance to the federal court order ceases at once, the further presence of federal troops will be unnecessary, and a blot upon the fair name and high honor of our nation in the world will be removed. Mob rule can not be allowed to override the decisions of our courts.
my fellow citizens. We are now an occupied territory. In the name of God, whom we all revere, in the name of liberty we hold so dear, in the name of decency which we all cherish, what is happening in America?
This served as a painful example that the civil rights movement was not only not widely accepted, but that the federal government needed to use its full force to enforce the laws as interpreted by the Supreme Court.
So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring in windy capitals. When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, or Little Traveler, man's first artificial satellite. Weighing about 185 pounds, Sputnik was a little bigger than a basketball and traveled 18,000 miles per hour, some 560 miles above the Earth. The impact of the Sputnik launch and the subsequent launch of Sputnik 2, a larger satellite carrying a dog, was tremendous in America. Paranoia that perhaps a bomb-carrying satellite could be launched swept the nation. If bomb shelters were popular before Sputnik, it certainly improved their sales.
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He'd duck and cover.
Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. This family knows what to do, just as your own family should. They know that even a thin cloth helps protect them. Even a newspaper can save you from a bad burn.
Fallout settles on your food. The food itself isn't harmed. You simply remove the fallout particles using everyday methods of food preparation. Peeling, wiping, or washing. Fallout swallowed accidentally with food or in drinking water would do you no immediate harm. If we remember these facts, if we act on them intelligently, we can increase our chances of surviving nuclear attack. And the key to survival is adequate shelter. That's why the federal government has a nationwide shelter program. The goal is adequate fallout shelter space for every man, woman, and child. And this goal can be reached. For with knowledge of radiation, we can face the facts about fallout and take action to protect ourselves against this hazard of the nuclear age.
Sputnik also forced America to concentrate on what would become known as the space race. This meant starting at the ground floor, education. America found itself in a situation not unlike the 1980s, with complacency causing mediocrity in schools. A Back to Basics program was started, and funding for space research was greatly increased, allowing America to take great strides forward in the space race in the years to come.
Liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
Roger, roll, Discovery. First roll program, Houston now controlling.
Our progress in space, taking giant steps for all mankind, is a tribute to American teamwork and excellence. Our finest minds in government, industry, and academia have all pulled together, and we can be proud to say we are first, we are the best, and we are so because we're free.
If you give me a week, I might think of one. That's what President Eisenhower told a reporter who asked what major decisions Vice President Nixon had participated in during their 8 years together. This jab was only one in a series of troubles that Richard Nixon would have during the 1960 presidential campaign. For Nixon, the biggest blow would come in the form of televised debates with John F. Kennedy. The first of 4 face-to-face meetings between the two candidates was watched by more than 70 million viewers, which made it a shame that Richard Nixon suffers from a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. Recovering from an infection that had hospitalized him for 2 weeks and arriving at the studio from the campaign trail minutes before the debate, Nixon was underweight and haggard-looking. Makeup artists attempted to conceal his constant 5 o'clock shadow with something called lazy shave that served only to make him look more pasty-faced and sinister. Jack Kennedy, on the other hand, was the picture of youth and athletic vigor. While radio listeners thought there was no clear winner in the debates, television viewers were magnetized by Kennedy. If FDR was the master of radio, JFK was the first telegenic candidate. It was as if he was custom-made for the instant image-making of the television age.
The debates actually have not influenced my decision whatsoever. They have pointed out to me, and I think to many people, that we have 2 terrific, dynamic candidates. They're both wonderful men.
I think that people have already made up their minds. I don't think the debates make that much difference.
Has it influenced you at all, the series of debates?
No, I still feel the way I did before.
I've listened to them, but I don't think it's influenced me too much. It's made me more strong to the one that I'm planning on voting for.
I've only seen one, and it's made me more undecided.
The show, as I would call it, has definitely influenced me. It swayed me back and forth. Prior to the watching both candidates on TV, I was for one and then the other. Now, I haven't made up my mind definitely, but they are definitely swaying me.
Well, I think they have influenced my decision as well as everybody else's decision. Sometimes they produce almost a state of indecision, and every debate I vacillate between one candidate and the other.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
In April 1961, a band of Cuban exiles invaded their homeland intending to overthrow Fidel Castro. Orchestrated by the CIA but denied air support, the attack at the Bay of Pigs quickly proved a disaster. More than 1,000 Americans were held prisoner, and Castro demanded $62 million for their release. He eventually settled for $53 million in food and drugs. On Sunday, December 23, 1962, the first returning prisoners reached Florida. The following Saturday, lined up in the Orange Bowl, they were given a hero's welcome. President Kennedy flew down and greeted them before a crowd of 40,000. He was given the brigade flag that the invaders had used, and in an emotional speech said, "I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana." Castro boasted that he had been able to hold America up for ransom. Of course, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October and November of 1962, Kennedy was able to hold Cuba up for the removal of missiles.
I have today been informed by Chairman Khrushchev that all of the IL-28 bombers now in Cuba will be withdrawn in 30 days. He also agrees that these planes can be observed and counted as they leave. Inasmuch as this goes a long way towards reducing the danger which faced this hemisphere 4 weeks ago, I have this afternoon instructed the Secretary of Defense to lift our naval quarantine.
January 27, 1973, brought a ceasefire to the Vietnam War under President Richard M. Nixon. And on March 29th of that year, the last American ground troops left Vietnam. On July 20th, 1969, during the height of American involvement in Vietnam, the world got a little smaller as Neil Armstrong uttered the famous, "That was one small step for man and a great leap for mankind." With that, America had attained the crowning achievement in the space race, placing a man on the moon.
Eagle, we got you now. It's looking good, over.
Good radar data. We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good.
We're go. Same type. We're go.
Altitude, velocity, light. 8.5 down. 220 feet. 15 forward. 11 forward. Coming down nice.
roughly 200 feet. 4.5 down. 5.5 down. 60 seconds. Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. Good. 40 feet down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. I'm going to step off the limb now. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Tranquility Base, Houston. Guidance recommendation is pings, and you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway.
But despite answering a nation's cries to end a war and sending a man to the moon, Richard Nixon would be most remembered for another not-so-celebratory event: Watergate. The scandal started with 5 men being arrested on June 17, 1972, for breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate apartment and office complex in Washington, D.C., and ended on August 8, 1974, as President Nixon announced his resignation on national television. The next day, Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as the new president. On September 8th, Ford pardoned Nixon for any crimes Nixon may have committed in the Watergate affair. Ron Ziegler, the presidential spokesman during the Watergate crisis, once said, "If my answers sound confusing, I think they're confusing because the questions are confusing and the situation is confusing, and I'm not in a position to clarify it."
It was stupidity at its very highest. Looking back, I don't understand why it happened that way. I think I do understand, but the reasons were apparently that the people on our White House staff and in the committee, with perhaps the best of intentions, felt that it was very important not to allow this particular break-in to be escalated into a way that it would affect so-called higher-ups. And so consequently, they tried to contain it. Now, there was no reason to be concerned about it affecting a higher-up. After all, that wasn't going to affect the election. We were leading McGovern, who was going to be the Democratic candidate, by a margin of 2-1 when that occurred. We were going to win going away anyway, because I had just come back from the great triumph of the Moscow summit. And of course, we were making progress in ending the war in Vietnam. But nevertheless, they felt that. And so as a result, they tried to come up with various schemes to contain it, to keep it from touching people higher up. And we didn't concentrate on doing what we should have done to clean it up right then when we could have. The way we handled it took what was basically a misdemeanor, a break-in in which nobody was hurt, and made it the crime of the century. I must say, with the assist of the media and the assist of our very, may I say, intelligent and ruthless Democratic opponents.
While the international hotspots during the 50s and 60s were Cold War battles waged in Eastern Europe and Asia, the scene shifted in the late 60s and early 70s. It was the Middle East that emerged as the world's most significant flashpoint, a political and military battlefield in which superpower rivalries were put on the back burner as Arabs and Jews struggled over the existence of Israel. In retaliation for supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the Arab-controlled Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, imposed an oil embargo on the United States and other countries. While the embargo was resolved in 1974, it did cause an energy crisis, as OPEC, now realizing its power, kept prices high and the oil supply low. Continuing problems with OPEC would keep the energy crisis present throughout the 70s. conflict in the Middle East came to a head on November 4th, 1979, when 500 Iranians stormed the American embassy in Tehran, capturing 90 American diplomats and beginning a hostage crisis that not only overshadowed Carter's historic negotiating of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, but effectively ended Jimmy Carter's hopes for governing effectively and being reelected. His inability to free the hostages, including a disastrous, abortive rescue mission that ended with 8 Americans dead in the Iranian desert, seemed to symbolize American powerlessness. In 1980, America turned to a man it thought represented old-style American ideals and strength. Ronald Reagan, the former movie star and governor of California, defeated Carter in the election.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office.
It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles there will be no compromise. It is time for us to realize that we're too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams. We're not, as some would have us believe, doomed to an inevitable decline. I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. I do believe in a fate that will fall on us if we do nothing. So with all the creative energy at our command, let us begin an era of national renewal. Let us renew our determination, our courage, and our strength. And let us renew our faith and our hope. We have every right to dream heroic dreams. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans.
And as a last insult to Carter and a symbol of the good fortune Reagan would enjoy, at the moment of Reagan's inauguration, the hostages were freed by Iran.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
The 80s marked a period of relative good times in comparison with the crises of the 70s. The 80s were also a time of struggle and difficulty. And as America looks forward to the next century, it also looks back to learn from a rich culture and history. America is truly a living dream. Its shores have welcomed millions of people, thousands of cultures, adding to the quilt that warms this land. All of these people continue to make this land richer, stronger, and more diverse. All of their work, their struggles, their victories make America what it is today. All of these people have the opportunity to realize their potential, realize what their ancestors only wished for and realize their dreams. This is America, the living dream.